Hello Yu-Gi-Oh players and welcome to Yu-Gi-Oh! Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0. So today, welcome to Holy Nuts Competitive Worm Theory. This is a video that I've been kind of trying to put off because I want to spread out my Holy Nuts videos over a wide expanse of time so I don't burn them all up. However, as many of you guys have seen, there is actually a worm player doing very well at ARG Circuit in Worcester right now. I believe he's 5-1-1, and it looks like he's got a very good chance of going to day 2. But I actually really disagree with a lot of the ways that he plays, and he's doing really well with it, so I mean, I can't say that he's a bad player for it, but there are a lot of ways that we differ in opinion. So I wanted to discuss why worms are so amazing and how you can play them in a competitive format. So first off, why worms are really good. In my opinion, they're the most underrated stun deck in the game right now. People just don't see them coming, and there's always the card reading advantage, which is where if your opponent has to read your cards every time you play one of them, then you have an advantage against them because they don't really understand how the deck works. Because they're so underrated, you never see them around. But they've also just got a ton of pluses set up. They're very good at monster removal, which is something that decks that a lot of stun decks don't do very well unless they do it with traps. They tend to rely on their monsters being large beaters and like stopping plays, but they're not very good at removing cards from the field. And they've also got one of the most broken trap cards ever created, and I'll get to that in a second. But the main combo for this deck is, of course, your Worm Zex and your Worm Yagin. Many of you guys already know that Worm Yagin, when it's flipped face up, it bounces a monster on your opponent's side of the field to their hand. And you can also special summon it from the graveyard if you have one face-up Worm Zex on the board. And Worm Zex can send Worm Yagin from the deck to the graveyard. So a lot of people like to open up with like Worm Zex, send Yagin, and then set Yagin from the grave. And then put down 4 back row. And that's a very, very solid opening hand, especially if you have your good friend W Nebula Meteorite. W Nebula Meteorite has way too many effects. Its ability is flip all face-down monsters face up, and then during the end phase you flip all face-up light reptile monsters face down, draw a card for each one that you flip face down, and then summon a Worm level 7 or higher monster from your deck, which we'll get to in a second. But what this does is it activates your Yagin during your opponent's turn. So it basically turns Yagin into a set compulsory, and then gives you tons of draws during the end phase, not to mention resetting your Yagin's effect. So if you combo these two correctly and you use Yagin at a smart time, you can force your opponent's biggest monsters off the board and reset his effect, and you can just get tons of pluses off of these 3 cards. A lot of players really like if whenever possible, they like milling Yagin to the grave with Zex, because you can then use Yagin's effect to set it face down from your graveyard. If I have a Yagin in my hand, I will almost never go for the Yagin Zex play. The reason being because if you set with your Yagin first hand, you get 2 uses out of it, which means that you get to flip it face up and bounce one opponent's monster, and then once it goes to the graveyard, you can summon that Zex and bring it out a second time, which makes the card even better in my opinion and gets you even more pluses. But of course that's a really nuanced situation. If you really need to get that Nebula off and get the extra draws, then you of course go for the Zex into Yagin play. The problem with trying to just mill all your Yagins and put them in the grave and use them with Zex is that once they're used, once they use their set from the grave effect, there's no use for them anymore because they get banished after they get removed from the field. So I tend to like opening with just the set Yagin, so I get its effect twice. But sometimes you just got to get that extra plus. And of course you can search them both out with Worm Carteros. You tend to run a play set of each of these. You try to max out on each of these. Sometimes I only run 2 Carteros just because sometimes it just isn't necessary. But Carteros speeds up the deck a lot. He's another flip effect monster that adds a level 4 or lower worm monster from your deck to your hand. He speeds up the plays, he makes Nebula even more broken if your opponent makes the mistake of leaving enough of your monsters on the board. So you tend to run 3 of each of those. And then, of course, there's the big beater, Worm King. Worm King is, I have the biggest love-hate relationship in the world with Worm King because While it's amazing if you get him for free off of Nebula, because it's like free beater plus drawing 2 cards plus activating and resetting your Yoggin's effect, he sucks nuts to draw into. Like, you draw him and you just realize right from then and there you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. Of course, you can summon him with just the sack of 1 worm monster, but in all reality, that's already a -1. If he runs into the bottomless, you are left extremely vulnerable since your normal summon in this deck is so important. I can't decide whether I want to run Worm King or not, because I draw him a lot, and that really sucks, but at the same time, he's one of your major win conditions. I'm actually thinking of taking him out of the deck because there are more win conditions, more big beaters that you can work with, that have different effects and are less likely to be clogged up in your hand. Never run more than 1 of this card. Some people run, 2 so that they can always have a target for Nebula, but in all reality, Nebula Plus is enough already that you don't need that extra Worm King. Worm King is just that extra beater to pull out of your deck with Nebula if you draw it Nebula first. The possibility of drawing into this card is so scary to Worm players that I just as soon take it out. So that's your worm lineup. I'm kind of going down the monsters right now and discussing how they're usable in the deck. But it's a really powerful engine. It's one of the more powerful stun engines in the game. It gets extremely consistent as long as you draw into a monster, which is a problem that the player at ARG Circuit has been having. Is that he draws into a ton of traps and never gets a monster. And when he did in that last round of his feature match, the first monster he got was a Worm King, and that just sucked so badly for him. So there are a lot of backup monsters that you use in this deck. One of the best is Fossil Dyna Pachycephalo. Not only is its effect activated when you flip it with W Nebula Meteorite, but when you combine it with a lot of other back row cards, this card ends the game for you. If you can keep this on the board, against a dragon player and they don't run Card Trooper, even if they do, you have outs for the Card Trooper, but if you can keep this card on the board, you basically win the game because, hell, you don't care about special summoning. This deck special summons like once every 2 or 3 turns, if that. So Fossil Dyna is an amazing card. You can pump it up with the one spell card that I wanted to talk about today, which is the Seal of Orichalcos. You can pump this guy up to 1700, make him a pretty serious beater. This card actually puts Worm's X at 2300, which is pretty powerful, which kind of makes Worm King obsolete. I know that Worm King is bigger, but if you have as much monster removal in this deck as you do, all you really need the beat stick factor for is taking out life points. And Seal of Orichalcos does that really well for this deck, and it makes your Fossil Dyna even bigger. It turns it into, basically, it just becomes a really powerful card at that point. I really like Seal of Orichalcos. You can also play it over Dragon Ravine in a pinch, and it's kind of a tech card for me. Not every player is going to use this card, and of course it isn't always good. Sometimes I end up siding it out, but I really enjoy this card, and you never summon from your extra deck anyway, so there are some really good plays with this card. And another one of your alternate monsters that I use is Granmole. Sometimes your opponent just has that Ophion on the board that you absolutely have to get rid of, and if you could put the Granmole on the board and keep flipping it back to the, flipping it away, then you don't have to worry about things like Pandemic. And the same is true of things like Dragasac. You don't have to worry about waiting for their next turn when they might, hit your Yoggin with its effect. There are just a lot of things that can go wrong if you have to rely on things going on in your opponent's turn, and Granmole really takes care of that. He's, once again, a really techy card. You can side him, you can main him, but I really like him just because he's instant monster removal if your opponent runs those extra deck heavy cards, or decks. And there are just a lot of extra deck cards that are problematic for this deck. Then you have your win conditions in this deck. The alternate beaters, one of the major issues that a lot of Worm players run into is just not running into a win condition, not running into a monster big enough to deal substantial damage before your opponent can pull themselves out of the water. So it is really essential that you run the proper balance of stun engine and beat sticks in your deck. And one of the great things about stun decks is there are stun monsters that are also beat sticks. One of the most important that you always run one of is Thunder King Ryo. Back in the day, Worms always ran 3 of this card because it was just so powerful. You put this on the board and you backed it up with like a Mirror Force or a D-Prison or Compulsory. You basically won the game at that point. So Although it's at 1, this card is really important. It's one of your main win conditions. One thing you can run, especially with skill drain being as much of a problem for this deck as it is Fencing Fire Ferret. If you're playing against Dragon Rulers, you can play your Fencing Fire Ferret. This card has 1700. It's got 2200 under Seal of Orichalcos. It can take out life points, and it can get rid of problem cards like Ophion. It can get rid of Scrap Dragon, a ton of different things. And deal some damage, and it operates under Skill Drain, which Grand Mole does not. So it's a beat stick, gets rid of problem cards, just generally a pretty good card, and you might consider running it. But the big MVP for me is Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer. Like, it doesn't make sense at all to run this card in a Worm deck, except for the fact that if you get it and you've used your resources correctly to whittle your opponent down to very few life points, you can put this card on the board and it ends the game. You can banish their 2 Dragon Tuners from the graveyard so they don't have as much fodder for their dragon. So even if they get rid of this card, they've run out of a ton of resources to use in order to put their dragons on the board. This card has 2300 once again under Seal of Orichalcos, which makes him pretty darn big. He can run over basically any Evil Swarm monster except, the Xyz monsters, and then banish their monsters so they can't use Krakion. Just great things you can do with this card. I've only been running 2, only because I don't have the 3rd one. The next time I can, I'm definitely going to be running 3 of this in the main deck. It stops Dragon Rulers, it stops spell books, it gets over Evil Swarms and takes out their graveyard, so it makes Krakion dead. This card is amazing, especially under Seal of Orichalcos. Now, the final thing you have to talk about when talking about worms and why they're so good and just competitive worm theory in general are the trap cards. Of course, we know the W Nebula Meteorite is like the most broken thing since I don't know what. This card is just freaking amazing. So you always max out on this card. You have to play W Nebula Meteorite carefully. You have to really know when to use this card and pick and choose how you use it. I never set this card until I get a worm monster to use it with. Because you don't want to be baiting MST with this card. This is the most important card in the deck, and you're not going to be using it during your turn unless you absolutely have to, in which case you should have had an out already. So this card actually sets up your opponent to do dumb things and run into Mirror Force and D-Prison. One of the things I love about playing Worms is that the entire game is psychological warfare. If you are playing Worms and your opponent expects a W Nebula Meteorite, they aren't going to go into their extra deck cards because they're afraid of it. They're afraid of W Nebula Meteorite into Yagin and getting my pluses. And this is where I punish my opponent for doing that. So what they do is they will fear the W Nebula Meteorite, which I might or might not actually have face down. They'll try to attack over my Yagin to try and get its effect off. I hit them with a Mirror Force or a D-Prison, and we go ham. Because especially against Dragon Rulers, if they've used resources to put a Dragon Rule on the board and you get rid of that particular resource, they're in a really tight situation. D-Prison is an amazing card against Dragon Rulers, and even Mirror Force works against them, even though they can go into the Dragosack at the start of Spark Dragon, because sometimes you can trick them into not going into their extra deck and then trying to make a big push on you. You can hit them with the Mirror Force, and that's really good. So the other cards that you have available to you, I don't actually have a Rivalry of Warlords, but it's really good for this deck against Evil Swarms, which are becoming increasingly popular. This deck already has a pretty decent Evil Swarm matchup, but it gets even better when you have Rivalry available. But what I do have are the other 3 big continuous locks. The nice thing about Imperial Iron Wall is if you just have 1 Yagin in your grave, you can keep reusing it under Imperial Iron Wall because it won't be banished when it's removed from the field. So you can just keep putting it in the graveyard and using it with Zek. So you don't have to worry about that quite so much anymore. Gozen Match and Vanity's Emptiness, of course, are things that you can chain to your opponents. And if you hit the Dragon Rulers with the Gozen Match at the right time, it's very difficult for them to come back from it, especially if you can also have that Imperial Iron Wall, and you can also have the Kaiku. Like, these 3 cards in combo, if you get those 3 cards, or even just 2 of them, you're in an extremely good situation. And when it comes to Emptiness, it's really, as we saw in the ARG Circuit feature match, it's really a matter of when you use this card. You only use this card when you really need to make sure that your opponent doesn't put those extra cards on the board, because otherwise all you have is, like, all your removal, which I put over here. You have your Mirror Force and your D-Prison. You can get rid of those cards that you normally would have hit with Emptiness. But imagine they summon like a Redox, and you're like, okay, you're not going to use Vanity's Emptiness against a Redox because very few cards in your deck lose to Redox. But once they hit that Corseska button or something, then you can put the Vanity's Emptiness on the board, and then they're in trouble. They're sitting there with a monster with very little attack. They can't special summon any more monsters this turn, and you can just beat them down with a Kaiku or with a Wormzex or with a Thunder King Ryo. So I have a very different Worm playstyle from the guy who was playing at ARG Circuit. I believe his name was Jackson something. But that's how I play Worms. I hope you guys like this video. If you did, hit that thumbs up button. If you didn't, let me know why, of course, in the comment section below. But if you guys want to see more analysis of decks that are extremely underrated and competitive theory, absolutely hit that subscribe button for Yu-Gi-Oh! News, shenanigans, and discussion. I believe I usually do that news, discussion, and general shenanigans. But anyway, meanwhile, thank you guys for watching Yu-Gi-Oh! And Business Casual. I'm your host, the RJB0, and I gotta jet. See you guys.